Story 1. Stopped to get gas in Baker, California on a road trip. I couldn't help but think of that quote from True Detective. This is like someone's memory of a town, and that memory is fading. Story 2. An orphanage in the mountains of Jamaica was specifically meant for physically and mentally disabled children. They received one meal a day, usually the same meal. The facility was extremely understaffed, and it was doubtful the workers were even paid. There was a room with about 12 handmade bassinets, each holding a baby, and only one woman to care for them all. There were obvious signs of emotional and physical neglect due to understaffing. Even though the workers were kind and devoted, there was only so much they could do. It has been 20 years, and it still makes me cry, especially now that I am a mother. I look at my 12-day-old son and cannot imagine him living like that. No child deserves such treatment. One particularly haunting scene was of a 12-year-old boy whose arms and legs were as thin as broomsticks. He spent 99% of his life in a crib that he was too tall for. Whether he was curled up because of that or due to his condition, I do not know. The workers would take him out once a day to cradle and feed him. He was partially blind and nonverbal. The most we were allowed to do was read to him. I wish I had the resources to help these places. It is one thing to know that children are living in these conditions, but seeing it, especially as a 14-year-old, is an unforgettable experience. I love Jamaica and its people. They are resilient and unique. We visited several orphanages, including one in Montego Bay. It is shocking that just a few blocks away on the coast, wealthy Americans indulge in endless jerk chicken and piña coladas, getting their hair braided at a fraction of the cost in the United States, completely oblivious to the starving children nearby. I still remember the face of one child. She was about 2 years old and had a shock of white hair above her right eyebrow amidst her black hair. I cannot recall her name, but I remember her face perfectly. Story 3. I worked for a while very near a Native American reservation, one of the very poor reservations. I am a firefighter, and we responded to the reservation somewhat frequently for fires or medical emergencies. It was shocking to me how impoverished these people were. It felt like walking around a third-world country, while just a few miles away, people were so wealthy they created a private road from the local airport to their gated community because they did not want to drive on the roads with the poor anymore. Story 4. Killing fields in Cambodia. Standing next to a tree where they found skull and brain fragments from babies who were killed by being swung into the tree. This happened in the 1970s. The genocide in Rwanda occurred in the 1990s. There have been many other genocides since. What are we doing? Also, Dachau, the concentration camp outside of Munich. I recommend visiting both. It is important for people to visit these places and learn. Story 5. Outer suburbs of Paris. It is very grim and depressing. Story 6. I am a registered nurse who volunteered in health services with the American Red Cross. It is really daunting and depressing working at a disaster site, especially when you arrive right after the incident. Story 7. House of Terror. Former Schutzstaffel and Geheime Staatspolizei headquarters in Budapest. The cells in the basement had shackles on the walls and drains in the floor. If you went into the room, you did not come out alive. I am not superstitious, but the place had a very eerie feeling, especially in the basement. Thousands of people were tortured and put to death. Story 8. Pripyat, Ukraine, near Chernobyl, was one of the most depressing places I have ever visited. The abandoned apartment buildings, schools with children's toys left behind, and an eerie silence made it feel like time had stopped after the nuclear disaster. It was haunting to see how life had been completely erased from an entire city. Story 9. The zoo in Himeji, Japan. If you go, I hope it is because you are planning to free the poor animals trapped in that place. Story 10. Salton Sea. Take any backwater, dejected town that makes you think, man, this place is dying. Then imagine it 40 years into the future. That is Salton Sea. Story 11. Went through Kensington in Philadelphia not long ago. I don't know if you can find a more depressing place than that. Story 12. My deceased cousin's bedroom. He passed away a while ago, and his room remains exactly as he left it in 2022. It is jarring to enter and see reminders on his calendar for March 2022. Story 13. I went to Atlantic City for the weekend during the winter with some friends. The city was dark, gray, drab, and smelled of cigarettes and desperation. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I started feeling ill. So I took a bus home that Saturday night. The people leaving Atlantic City on a Saturday night were not a happy group. Story 14. A brothel in Germany. I was living there with a German woman, and we broke up. Naturally, I was playing sad songs on repeat. Air Supply's Without You featured heavily. A friend of mine suggested that, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So I went to a brothel, walked in, and it looked like a dentist's waiting room but with more bored prostitutes. I thought, no, I'm not that depressed, and walked back out. Story 15. I once stopped in Needles, California. Afterwards, my friend told me they only named it Needles because no one knows how to spell syringe there. Story 16. S21. Also known as the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, and the killing fields in Cambodia represent a beautiful country with a dark and relatively recent past, epitomizing the unconscionable effects of evil. Possibly more depressing still were the predatory Western men courting amputee children injured by landmines. Story 17. Westbury is a town in southern England, in Wiltshire. I have nothing against it, but it was the train station where I was often at 10 p.m. traveling home. I frequently traveled between Southampton and Exeter at the time, and the station always made me feel depressed. Maybe it was the closed cafe that looked like it would be nice when open. Maybe it was the hanging baskets of flowers under the moonlight and artificial light. Maybe I was just homesick. Regardless, the place always made me sad. Story 18. Some dark street with a lone gasoline station in Hoboken, New Jersey. Story 19. When I went to America, Hollywood during the day was very dirty. Homeless people were everywhere. It was absolutely crowded with tourists, but so depressing as it looked filthy. If it is like that during the day, I cannot imagine what it is like at night. Story 20. There is a very funny feeling that washes over you when all the servers start line dancing at the Texas Roadhouse in Dubai. Story 21. Not going to disclose the location, but a hot zone I visited during my time in the military. Spent a few months there. The city felt like traveling decades back in time. Everything about it was like that. The locals talked to me as if I were an alien. Our lives seemed like a science fiction film to them, something they had only seen in movies and seemed unreal. The only leisure activity was the local cinema. 2 movies a day. I never missed any when I had the time. Somewhat recent films were played by an ancient projection machine with plastic chairs. It was cold, so cold that it physically hurt. Everywhere was cold, and heaters were barely available. I spent days without seeing my skin. Hot water was rare. We had a covert base, so conditions there were no better when we were stationed. Death barely meant anything, as there was no life to begin with. Every noon, the names of the people who died were announced from the mosque. I remember my barber casually talking about how he lost his niece the day before. Aside from the cinema, my favorite activity was playing songs in my head and writing their lyrics on paper since no smartphones were allowed in the base. Officer or not, it didn't matter. Playing backgammon was another activity, but it was tricky since playing it was considered a sin games in general, so only some people were open to play. The same applied to listening to music. No music was played anywhere. As an atheist, I never told anyone, of course. I understood their strong religious stigmas. The dream of one day going to heaven was all they had. It has been many years, and I haven't had a single moment of depression since then. It feels unfair to do so to all the people still living there. Story 22. Psychiatric ward of a children's hospital. Heard children sobbing and pleading to go home. A depressing circle of kids singing Count on Me by Bruno Mars. Had to go there a few times for a project. Cried on the drives home. Story 23. Honestly, it would probably be Las Vegas. I went once with friends. I am not a big gambler, but I like Texas Hold'em. I went to a casino a little off the strip with a friend and witnessed some depressing scenes in a short period of time. A full-grown man crying at the blackjack table, a woman who apparently urinated herself at a slot machine instead of getting up, and just some sketchy people. The worst was probably seeing the hordes of elderly people continuously pumping money into the slot machines nonstop. They kept pressing the buttons with little to no expression on their faces, literally hitting the buttons as fast as they could. Story 24. Vancouver is a beautiful city with friendly people. Just last week, we stayed in a nice waterfront hotel. We took a walk to what used to be Chinatown. Suddenly, we were in an area with high drug activity. I never felt threatened, but there were people exhibiting drug-related behavior, such as stooping with a bent posture like zombies people, in small groups smoking crack cocaine or fentanyl, and others sleeping on dirty sidewalks. It was very sad, especially since this was just a few streets away from nice areas. I guess the decriminalization of hard drugs does not work, but putting drug users in jail does not work either. It is heartbreaking to see the impact fentanyl has had on people. Story 25. Post. Texas is probably the saddest looking place I have ever driven through. Story 26. Prison for more than 14 years. Solitary confinement for 8 years. Story 27. Among the places I have visited, Cairo, Illinois. I drove through there once as a detour due to an accident on Interstate 24. The town was desolate, abandoned, and decayed. Not a single living being was seen while driving through that town. East St. Louis, Illinois. It is not as desolate compared to Cairo since it is across the river from St. Louis, Missouri, but it gives the impression of urban and economic decay. The city has a reportedly high crime rate, which probably deters people from visiting. Among the places I have lived, Kirksville, Missouri. The town itself is not necessarily a bad place, but it feels isolated from the rest of the country. It was very easy to feel depressed when living there, especially during the winter. On the plus side, autumn was comfortable and beautiful. Story 28. In Cairo, Illinois, located at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, the city is nearly abandoned due to flooding. It is sad to see. In the suburbs of Guatemala City before the COVID-19 pandemic, my wife and I went there several years ago for a mission trip. They took us to visit areas of extreme poverty that were unimaginable. The city dump, known locally as the Bajuro, has a colonia nearby where people build houses so they can access the dump daily to scavenge recyclable materials such as glass and plastic. Stronger individuals get the better items, while weaker people take what remains. Some families have lived there for generations. Another colonia we visited had a group of children born over approximately 10 years who have no fathers. The fathers were all killed in gang violence. We saw 10 people, spanning 4 generations, living in a very small house just to survive. They live on about $500 per year. Girls and women have little value beyond sex, cooking, and housekeeping. They are exploited, become pregnant, and often end up divorced or raising children alone, without the means to find jobs to support themselves because they are deemed worthless women. Story 29. Depressing does not quite feel like the right word, but it is close enough. In southeastern California, there is an inland body of salt water called the Salton Sea. Several years ago, I spent some time in a few towns on the west coast of the Salton Sea, in particular the towns of Salton City, Desert Shores, and Oasis, and they all had a certain eeriness to them I have not felt anywhere else. I have spent a lot of time in small towns all around the western United States. Back in the 1960s, a number of little resort towns popped up along the shores of the Salton Sea. In the 1980s, the salinity of the sea varied wildly, which, combined with agricultural runoff polluting the water, caused a mass die-off of the sea's fish. The dead fish washed up on the shores and started rotting. The smell and sight of this pretty well killed the tourism industry. What remains are all but ghost towns and a lingering ecological disaster. Story 30. I worked in Rawlins, Wyoming years ago. I still describe the 2 months I was there as the longest 8 years of my life. The place was desolate, filled with drunkenness and cliques without any clear reason. The number one employer was a state prison. The wind blew constantly, only stopping to change direction. Shockingly, I have not returned. Story 31. Port Arthur in Tasmania. That was before the shooting there. I have never been to a place with such an oppressive atmosphere. Story 32. the Holocaust Museum in Washington, District of Columbia. The entire place was unnerving and had a sinister feel as you walked through. I cannot imagine what an actual former campsite in Europe would feel like. Story 33. When I visited Tempe, Arizona, I walked to a Circle K and talked to the cashier who was Native American. We were having a casual conversation when I asked her what life on the reservation was like. She shocked me with stories about herself and others being assaulted when she was very young and living among the same people until she was in her 20s. She also mentioned widespread drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues, and how common suicide is there. One part one won't forget is when she said, "Just in case you thought it was all powwows and teepees." Story 34. Roebourne, Western Australia, is a remote area thousands of kilometers from any form of civilization. It is notorious for violence, alcoholism, drug abuse, and rampant child abuse. My advice, if you ever find yourself anywhere near it, is to keep going and not stop anywhere but there. Story 35. Camden, New Jersey. I used to deliver beer to a convention center there. The first time I was heading there, I came off the exit and saw a person with a missing arm begging for money. That still haunts me. The city is run down and depressing, except for the area near Campbell's Soup and the Rutgers University campus. I have wanted to go to OG Donkey's for a cheesesteak, but I drive an hour out of my way to go to their Medford location instead. I have seen enough of Camden. Story 36. Cambodia. The whole area of the country that we visited was depressing, especially the Tunnel Sap Lake area where we saw poverty like we had never seen before. Children in rags begging for scraps. It was awful, especially in such a beautiful surrounding area. Story 37. Tiger Kingdom near Phuket, Thailand. All the tigers were sedated so tourists could take photos with them. If the tourists wanted a show, the keeper would hit the male tiger's testicles with a bamboo stick. The tigers were heavily drugged, and the keepers would just push them into position for each photo. We turned around and left immediately. Story 38. Probably a tie between a Navajo reservation in New Mexico and Gary, Indiana. Story 39. I interned at a divorce lawyer's office once. The saddest place was the small play area for children inside the court complex. Children played there, unaware that their mother and father would never be together again and were literally fighting over them. Story 40. Did a 6-month road trip from Quebec, Canada to Costa Rica last winter to chase summer and whitewater. The night before we crossed from Chiapas, Mexico into Guatemala, we stopped in a place called Arriaga. Arriaga is often the first stop for migrants coming through Mexico from other Latin American countries who are fleeing poverty and starvation, usually with the United States as their end goal. There is a train that departs from Arriaga known as La Bestia or the Beast, also called El Tren del Muerte, meaning the train of death. It departs from Arriaga and bypasses many Mexican immigration and military checkpoints, eventually ending outside of Mexico City. People ride on top. As it bypasses these checkpoints, the people who ride atop are often victims of various kinds of abuse, robbery, and assault. There are individuals who regularly prey on the least fortunate. This train also runs through the night, so it is not uncommon for people to fall asleep, fall off the train, and end up dead or dismembered. We gathered funds the night before to make a large donation to a local migrant house run by the Lions Club that allows people to stay for a few days before heading to the train. They provide shelter, some food, and first aid if needed. That migrant house was the most heartbreaking place I have ever been. Shattered every illusion I ever had about the kinds of people who were trying to leave their countries and head north. It is not full of grown men. Grown men were the minority. There were pregnant women. The number of children there had me holding back tears the whole time, and I had to walk away a few times. There was one boy I spoke to who could not have been older than 9. He was traveling alone from Guatemala for the second time because the first time he tried, he was caught by Mexican authorities and sent back to Guatemala. The boy was heading north to meet family he had never met before in the United States. He had already had a long and dangerous journey, still so full of hope and youthful joy, but so sad and broken at the same time. I hope he made it. I felt very guilty being on a recreational trip on my way to Costa Rica to paddle in paradise. While these people, the majority of whom were children under 18 and their mothers, were fighting just to get to a place where they would not die of starvation. I will never forget that boy. Story 41. Calcutta in the 1970s. Giant, stinking malaria-ridden slums which were home to hundreds of thousands of the most deprived and desperate people in history. Enormous mountains of garbage and waste, crawling with naked children and starving outcasts scraping out the barest of livings at landfill dumps beside the main arterial road. To the airport, they would collect anything of value for resale, such as used plastic bags, and eat anything remotely edible they found. Dogs often with rabies, crows, cows, and huge vultures swarmed all over. The vultures feasted on the corpses of sacred cows and poor humans who could not afford cremation. Every street was open sewer drainage, infested with mosquitoes. Children and adults alike, the poorest of the poor, unashamedly defecated directly into the roadside gutters and drains while traffic rolled on by, dodging cows, completely unperturbed by the sight. Starving beggars were everywhere, in their thousands. Children, elderly, disabled, disfigured, blind, toothless, grotesquely leprous. All of it. Extremely hot and insanely humid. Almost all streets were dirt. Monsoonal rains would overflow the roadside gutters and turn the streets into a quagmire of disease-ridden sewage and mud. Partially cremated corpses floated down the Hooghly River, a distributary of the Ganges, in macabre and grotesque postures of death. Those that washed ashore were being eaten by vultures constantly. Cremation ghats burned and stank incessantly. The heaviest and most pollutive industries imaginable spewed smoke into the air and toxins into the river, night and day, the waters of which millions bathed daily. The air was so thick with smoke, dust, and pollution that it was literally the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes per day. Most people also smoked, including children fortunate enough to get hold of cigarettes somehow. Age was no barrier. Many children under 5 years old smoked. Death was everywhere, but so too was life. The sheer desperation to live was palpable and ever-present. It was a lot for a westernized child under 10 to take in. Possibly the hardest thing was witnessing what some of the kids my own age had to live. I got to leave. They did not. Story 42. Rural Cambodia is absolutely brutal emotionally. I still cry every time I talk about it. Without going into details, understand that landmines are still everywhere, including where rice is planted. Children work the fields and the mines go off. Many survive, but the injuries are as severe as you would expect. There is virtually no preventative medical care or vaccines, so polio is widespread, children have cataracts, and many are disabled from preventable illnesses. Children's growth is stunted and many go hungry. When I was there, little ones were picking up chicken bones and table scraps from roadside shacks where tourists stop for lunch. Sex trafficking is widespread because the government, which is not democratic and has ties to the former regime, has failed, making it a haven for dangerous people. The country has one of the highest rates of human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Despite all that, the people were resilient, friendly, kind, and persevered. I was working with a local startup that employed disabled young people, and it was a joy every day. The food is amazing, especially fish and fresh fruit. It is a humbling experience and a gorgeous country. Siem Reap is a bucket list destination everyone should prioritize. The waterfalls and pools in the jungle are magical. I would never shy away from going, but the first time I went alone, it was really hard. Story 43. Fresno, California. A seedy party at night was not fun at all. Story 44. Winslow, Arizona. I live in Arizona, and the state is filled with beautiful and varied landscapes, canyons, mountains, and stunning vistas. But Winslow is not one of those places. It is in a flat, boring part of the state. One of the biggest employers is a large prison complex nearby. If you were thinking of visiting just to stand on a corner in Winslow, like in the Eagles song, do not waste your time. Winslow is like, without that one line in an old song, what else do you have? The answer is not much. Out of all the many interesting places here, Grand Canyon, Sedona, Oak Creek Canyon, Payson, Jerome, Winslow is the most disappointing. It makes Casa Grande look exciting. Story 45. India. The level of poverty was unlike anything I could have imagined. It was absolutely overwhelming. Seeing so many children begging on the street shook my whole world. Story 46. Centralia, Pennsylvania. The entire town was abandoned years ago due to underground coal mine fires that are still burning. It is eerie to walk along what used to be roads and see smoke rising from cracks in the ground. Story 47. Detroit in the 1970s and 1980s was once a grand city, known as the Paris of the Midwest, and the fourth largest in the nation. Now it is the 26th largest. Gary, Indiana was worse, but it did not have as far to fall. Story 48. Las Vegas. The area outside the main tourist corridor is unpleasant, and the interior of the casinos is disappointing. Story 49. An active mountaintop removal mine in West Virginia, Cayford Mountain. There was a family's ancestral home there who all refused to sell to the company, so the mountain was being blown up all around them, even the cemetery. Everything was covered in thick dust, and they were constantly harassed with dogs shot and run off the road. Story 50. Jackson, Mississippi. About 10 years ago, anyone who had more than $10 left the city. Story 51. Labadee, Haiti. Royal Caribbean has a private port of call there. The people working there asked us if we could get them a burger or hot dog from the buffet as they were not fed there. We walked over to the end of the private port and it looked like something out of Jurassic Park. A 20-foot tall fence with razor wire on the top. That experience is one of many reasons we do not cruise anymore. Story 52. I live in northern Michigan. One time I was driving home from Chicago. You have to go around the bottom of Lake Michigan. I was young and poor, and these were the days of spotty cell connection for those global positioning system devices. I thought I could avoid paying the Skyway bridge toll if I just went around parallel to it. I got lost in the most depressing streets of Gary, Indiana. The global positioning system was not working. I drove right up to the lake shore and figured it out from there. I was stunned. I came from a world where the lake shore is always wealthy, and it shows. In Gary, the battered streets just end there, and it is empty, so empty. I felt physically sad going through there. Never again. Take the Skyway. Just do it. Story 53. Memphis. I thought there would be a vibrant downtown with music, and the river would be packed with riverboats offering shows and gambling. It was deserted, with many boarded-up storefronts, dirty, and felt very dangerous. Story 54. My parents are from Karachi, Pakistan. I could not name a single place I have seen or been to that is more depressing than Pakistan as a whole for the most part. I have traveled to quite a few countries and explored a good portion of the United States. The power goes out every day or so to conserve energy for hours. Many people do not have air conditioning in their homes or any transportation. Most of the streets are filled with people who do not have slippers or shoes. Some children do not even have any clothes at all. The number of people you see literally eating out of the trash is sickening and heartbreaking. We slaughtered a few goats and went to specific poorer neighborhoods to hand out the meat to children. Many of them cried and hugged us. If you give them a 2-liter bottle of soda, they will have the biggest smile on their face and tell you they have not had it in years. For perspective, it is only about 100 Pakistani rupees, which is less than $1. Story 55. I'm in upstate New York and we took a road trip down south. Our route included going through western West Virginia. There was construction or an accident, so we were rerouted through some back roads. It was really depressing to see how poor people are. The poverty we see in the cities is nothing compared to the rural areas. It was eye-opening. Story 56. Inner Florida. The farther south you go from Disney, the more it becomes bleak. Story 57. Agra, India, is home to the Taj Mahal, a wonder of the world and amazing in many ways. However, before you enter the gates and driveway up to the entrance, you will pass through the main part of Agra. The poorest of the poor can be found there, with people begging and tapping on your vehicle window for money or anything you might be willing to give. I saw someone give a little child a few rupees, and the child's companion suddenly punched him, took the money, and ran. It was very sad, and I have never forgotten how destitute the area is. Story 58. Probably my ex's place in Texas. They used to live with their parents in a rundown trailer park at the time, and it had this sense of absolute hopelessness. Empty lots with crumbled concrete, burnt-out trailers, bullet holes everywhere, stray animals running around, very unfriendly-looking people with falling apart. Trailers that had big fences with barbed wire and "trespassers will be shot" signs. It did not help that, as we were driving slowly through, trying not to run over one of the many cats, they were telling me the history of how a person was murdered in one trailer and a family perished in the fire that burnt another trailer. When you went into the house, their parents were incredibly depressing. The second time I went, I was recovering from a suicide attempt, and they made me feel like I wanted to do it all over again. Story 59, Jamaica. You ride this bus to your luxury resort through pure human suffering. You arrive at paradise and forget what you just witnessed. Story 60. Not so much a place I traveled to, but as a former truck driver, the saddest thing I once saw was a funeral of two vehicles, the hearse and one car. I thought to myself it was sad that nobody cared. Story 61, Chernobyl. The abandoned town is eerie, and the stories of the disaster make it incredibly somber. Story 62, San Pedro Sula, Honduras. They have Kentucky Fried Chicken but no biscuits. The buses have an actual guard riding shotgun. Story 63. My first thought was Gallup, New Mexico, but then I remembered my recent stop at the Salton Sea in California. Weird, depressing, and a smell like nothing I have ever smelled before. That has to be the winner. Story 64. A casino, slot machines, and the atmosphere were so depressing I don't know how people get into those things. Story 65. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. When I went to Germany, it was something I felt I had to see. Once you leave the memorial part and walk into the former campgrounds, it is something else. The vastness and the obvious history that come with a place as significant as that. Story 66. Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom. Practical but somewhat empty and sad concrete jungle. Story 67. Residential school in Canada. There were talks of tearing down that awful place, so we decided to stop in and pay our respects to people we knew attended there. Very emotional, lonely, and cold atmosphere. Standing on the main road, looking down its long path and realizing there are unmarked graves in the area, as well as those discovered during the waterline digs. Very depressing. They were so close to home in life and in death, yet their families have no idea where their children were or are. Story 68. Dubai is the most racist and class-oriented place I have ever had the misfortune to visit. A velvet-lined cesspit. Story 69. Gorky Park in Moscow is a rundown amusement park where children rode rides without screams or smiles. In fact, I did not see anyone smile during my 10 days in Russia, but I did see a homeless leper. There is no middle class, at least when I was there in 2001. People were either extremely poor or extremely wealthy. The summer and winter palaces made me sick. The gilding, stolen art, and over-the-top opulence were a snub to the struggling majority. Story 70. My own neighborhood. I live in a deindustrialized city surrounded by Detroit, and it is awful. We bought this house because it was cheap, and I was in college, but now we are desperate to escape. It is depressing, and the people who run this town are a very peculiar kind of foolish. The lead in the water or the terrible schools, maybe both. Story 71. I used to work on cruise ships. Most of the places they visit seem absolutely lovely and luxurious if you stick to tourist areas. But if you walk a block or two past the shops and restaurants, you will quickly find that it is all a facade and the people who live there are living in extreme poverty. Story 72. I have been to a town in Sierra Leone built by the government to house a large number of people, mostly women and children, whose hands were cut off by rebels during the Civil War. It is a town of people without hands. Story 73, 3 answers. East St. Louis, Dubai, and rural New Mexico. I went to East St. Louis when I was in my early 20s and discovered an urban poverty of a kind that I simply did not understand could exist in the United States in the 21st century. I was young and inexperienced, from blue-collar New England, and totally bought into the American dream myth. I think that trip radicalized me. The first time I went to Dubai, I felt like everyone else was in on a joke that I did not get. How could they be impressed by shopping malls and concrete? People were admiring this absurd and upsetting version of capitalism run amok. This was my first trip to Asia, and I had hoped I would learn more about the culture of the people, but Dubai is a city completely devoid of any culture. The natives are invisible, the slaves are invisible, and everything else is just the world's worst people trying to impress each other. I have been back several times, and while I will never like the place, I am not as utterly depressed and horrified by the consumption and falsehood as I was the first time. By the time I drove through rural New Mexico a few years back, I was not surprised by the poverty. I understood more about the United States by then, but it was still really, really sad. It was clear that these were people totally abandoned by the prosperity of the East Coast, and unlike urban poverty, rural poverty somehow feels worse because at least in the middle of a city slum, there is a bus to the nice area. Story 74. Cuba. I went there for only 5 days. I felt miserable. People were starving, and electricity and water were shut off many times a day. Buildings were about to collapse. Young girls around 10 to 12 years old were working as prostitutes. I do not care how beautiful the tourist areas are. I will never set foot there again. Story 75. After Hurricane Katrina, when I flew there to rescue animals, I also volunteered at a dog rescue in Italy. It was the saddest experience ever. Story 76. The field where the Battle of Gettysburg took place. It was a heavy feeling walking around there, and it made me very sad. Story 77. India. The poverty is depressing. We drove for an hour at around 3 a.m., and there were whole families just sleeping on the sidewalk. Story 78. Harrah's Casino in Metropolis, Illinois, was the most run-down, cigarette-stained, drug-infested casino I have ever visited. The atmosphere there felt sad. Also, Cairo, Illinois, the entire town. Story 79. A lot of people love Asheville, North Carolina, and I do too. However, the number of homeless people is very sad. Half of the people are walking around spending money on unnecessary things, while the other half are hungry and homeless. I cannot enjoy myself there. Story 80. This small town in the Midwest was almost abandoned. The only thing remaining was a strip club that kept the town afloat. It had a real from dusk till dawn vibe about it. Story 81. Stockton, California. I had to stop there once to put gas. At the gas station, I felt like I was being watched, and I had an uneasy feeling while being there. Story 82. Some marine park in Miami had 2 manatees in a tank the size of an above-ground pool, just swimming in circles. They were so huge they touched each other. I cried from the moment we arrived until the moment we left. My mom told me I ruined Mother's Day. Story 83. Nicaragua is a beautiful country, but the treatment of animals is poor. Dogs roam with obvious broken bones and are emaciated. Horses pull carriages despite being nearly blind from injuries sustained to control them. Birds are kept in cages without feathers due to extreme stress. Story 84. Some of the housing schemes in Scotland are incredibly bleak. They are extremely poor, dilapidated, rough, full of drug addicts and alcoholics, unruly children, and the added cold, gray, and wet weather does not improve the atmosphere. In the past, places like Easterhouse, Postle Park, and Springburn in Glasgow, and Niddry and Muirhouse in Edinburgh were particularly bad. Story 85. Dubai is quite depressing when you examine it closely. There is extreme wealth alongside severe poverty and exploitation. Women face significant abuse. There are outdated laws against anything that is disliked, such as alcohol and pork. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.